Upon starting work as a caregiver in a mansion, a humble woman senses an atmosphere of tension, secrets, and manipulation. She uncovers a sinister plan to declare the elderly woman incapacitated and seize the inheritance through forged documents. At the final moment, she exposes the truth in front of everyone and becomes the key to unraveling a criminal conspiracy. The sun had barely risen when Irene Owens passed through the imposing gates of the mansion on the Upper East Side, a prestigious neighborhood in New York City. At 45, she carried on her back a lifetime of work as a caregiver for the elderly, and in her hands, a small suitcase with her essential belongings. The contrast between her simplicity and the opulence of the property could not have been greater. Coming from the Bronx, Irene was single-handedly raising her two teenage children, Gregory and Tanya, after her husband left without explanation 5 years ago. The opportunity to work for the Alastair family meant not only a better salary, but the chance to ensure her children completed their education, a dream she nurtured with the same care she gave her patients. A middle-aged woman, impeccably dressed in a grey suit, opened the door before Irene could even ring the bell. "You must be the new caregiver. I'm Victoria Alastair," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come in. I'll show you the house and introduce you to Mrs. Eleanor." Irene followed Victoria through the mansion's interior, carefully observing every detail. After nearly 20 years working in family homes, she had developed a sixth sense for picking up on unspoken dynamics, the secrets hidden between the lines of glances, in the tone of voices, in the arrangement of objects. "Mrs. Eleanor has her moods," Victoria explained as they ascended the marble staircase. "She sometimes gets confused. She's 82 and, well, age takes its toll. My husband, Richard, is her only son, and he's away on business in Europe. I'm the one who takes care of everything around here." Irene simply nodded, storing every word. She was already familiar with that speech that subtly cast doubt on an elderly person's sanity. Often it was the first step to justify decisions made without their consent. Upon entering the room, Irene saw an elegant lady sitting in an armchair near the window. Despite her advanced age, Mrs. Eleanor Alastair maintained an erect posture, her white hair perfectly arranged in a low bun. She gazed out the window with a mixture of melancholy and dignity. "Eleanor, this is Irene, your new caregiver," Victoria announced. The elderly woman turned slowly and fixed a piercing gaze on Irene. "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor," Irene greeted with genuine respect. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs." Eleanor studied Irene's face for a few seconds before replying, "The pleasure is mine. Come, sit here beside me." Victoria frowned. "I'll leave you to get better acquainted. Irene, when you're finished, come to the library so we can discuss your schedule and responsibilities." As soon as the door closed, the atmosphere seemed to lighten. Mrs. Eleanor sighed deeply. "So, you're the new victim," she said, an ironic smile playing on her lips. "I'm sorry, Mum," Irene asked, surprised. "We've had 3 caregivers in the last 2 months. They all quit, or were made to quit, to be more precise." Irene sat in the chair indicated by the elderly woman. "May I ask why?" "Because I'm not as cooperative as they would like," Mrs. Eleanor replied, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders. "My daughter-in-law prefers people who follow her instructions without question." "And what are those instructions?" "Extra medications, exaggerated reports about my mental confusion, little lies about things I supposedly said or did." Irene maintained a neutral expression, but internally, her alarms went off. She knew this scenario well. "Mrs. Eleanor, I am a professional. I follow medical orders and respect the household hierarchy, but my primary commitment is to my patient's well-being." The elderly woman smiled, this time with her eyes as well. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." Then, lowering her voice, she added, "Something is happening in this house, Irene. Something I can't fully comprehend. Documents appear for me to sign, conversations stop when I enter a room, and Victoria, she acts as if this house is already hers. Do you have any other family members you can contact?" "Richard, my son, but he's always traveling, absorbed in his business. The company belonged to my husband, Edward, who stepped down due to health problems. 10 years ago," Mrs. Eleanor hesitated. "Edward is in a specialized clinic. He barely recognizes people. Irene nodded, understanding. There's also Frederick Mendoza, Edward's old business partner and Richard's godfather. He comes by weekly for meetings with Victoria. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Antonia, the housekeeper, announced that lunch would be served in 30 minutes. "I'll help you get ready for lunch," Irene offered. While helping Mrs. Eleanor change her clothes, Irene noticed purple bruises on her arms. "What happened here, Mrs. Eleanor?" "Oh, this? I must have bumped into something," she replied vaguely. Irene didn't press the matter but mentally registered the information. After finishing dressing the elderly woman, she accompanied her to the dining room downstairs. The meal passed in awkward silence. Victoria dominated the conversation, talking about social events and decisions already made about renovations to the house. Occasionally she cast assessing glances at Irene, as if sizing up an opponent. After lunch, Victoria led Irene to the library. The room, panelled in dark wood and filled with antique books, had the weight of family history ingrained in every object. "Your responsibilities are simple," Victoria began, handing over a detailed schedule. "Basic. Care assistance at meals, monitoring medication. This is the current prescription list." Irene examined the list of medications, recognizing most of them. Antihypertensives, vitamins, a mild anxiolytic. Nothing that would justify mental confusion. "Mrs. Eleanor seems quite lucid to me," Irene commented. Victoria smiled coldly. "She has good days and bad days. She can appear perfectly normal and, minutes later, confuse people, dates, events. The family doctor, Dr. Morris, comes weekly. He can explain the situation better." When Victoria left the library, Irene remained for a moment, absorbing the information. Her instincts, sharpened by years of experience, warned her that something was wrong with this family dynamic. That night, after settling Mrs. Eleanor in for bed, Irene went to the small room assigned to her, adjacent to her employer's. As she arranged her few clothes in the closet, she heard muffled voices coming from the hallway. Silently, she cracked open the door and saw Victoria talking to a tall, grey-haired man in front of Mrs. Eleanor's room. From the formality of his suit and briefcase, he looked like a lawyer. "We need to finalize this soon, Mr. Graham," Victoria whispered. "Frederick is getting impatient. By the time Richard gets back from his trip, it will be too late." "The documents will be ready on Friday," the man replied, "but we still need her signature." "Leave that to me." Irene closed the door without a sound. Something was definitely wrong in this house, and she had just confirmed her suspicions. Taking out her phone, she sent a message to her daughter, Tanya. "Everything okay there? The new job seems interesting. I promise to tell you more later. Kisses. Take care of your brother." Lying in the narrow bed, Irene reflected on her first impression of the Alastair mansion. Behind the facade of wealth and tradition, there was tension and secrets, and somehow she knew that Mrs. Eleanor would need much more than just physical care. She fell asleep with the certainty that this would not be just another job in her long career as a caregiver. It would be a test of her integrity and courage. If this story has piqued your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Continuing. Irene had been at the Alastair mansion for a week when she noticed a pattern. Every Wednesday at precisely 3 p.m, Frederick Mendoza, Mrs. Eleanor's husband's old partner, would show up for closed-door meetings with Victoria. In the days following these meetings, Victoria would always suggest new medications or changes to the elderly woman's routine. On that sunny morning, Irene was helping Mrs. Eleanor with breakfast in the mansion's conservatory. The elderly woman seemed particularly cheerful. "You know, Irene, this house used to be full of joy," Mrs. Eleanor commented, watching the birds that came to eat the breadcrumbs she threw. "Edward loved having friends over, throwing parties. Now it feels like a mausoleum. Do you miss those times?" "Every day." Mrs. Eleanor sighed, her gaze fixed on a particularly lush rosebush. Edward planted that rosebush when Richard was born. He said the flowers would get more beautiful each year, just like our son. Irene smiled, touched by the memory. "That's a beautiful tradition. Richard never had the patience for gardening, or for many things really. Mrs. Eleanor lowered her voice as if afraid of being overheard. "He's a good son, but he has always been easily influenced, especially by Frederick, his godfather, who practically raised him in the business world. And Mrs. Victoria, how long have they been married?" 5 years. It was a rushed wedding, right after she started working at the company as an executive assistant. Mrs. Eleanor paused. Edward never fully trusted her, but he was already very frail when they got married, so there was little he could do. At that moment, the mansion's phone rang, and Antonia, the housekeeper, came to announce that Richard was on the line, wanting to speak with his mother. Mrs. Eleanor's expression lit up. Irene helped her up and accompanied her to the study. Out of respect for her privacy, she left the elderly woman alone in the room but remained, near the ajar door in case she needed help. "Richard, my son, yes, I'm fine. The new caregiver. She's competent, don't worry. When are you coming back?" "Oh, another 2 weeks." Mrs. Eleanor's voice betrayed disappointment. "No, you don't need to worry. I'm being well taken care of. Yes, Victoria mentioned the meeting with the lawyer." "No, I haven't signed anything yet. I'd rather wait for you to come back if you don't mind." "It's all right, son. I understand that business requires your presence. I love you too." When Irene returned to help Mrs. Eleanor back to the garden, she noticed the elderly woman's eyes were teary. "Is everything all right, Ma'am?" "Richard postponed his return again. Sometimes I think he prefers to stay away from here." That afternoon, while Mrs. Eleanor was resting, Irene took the opportunity to discreetly explore the mansion. She started in the library, where Victoria kept a desk with documents. She didn't intend to snoop, but her concern for Mrs. Eleanor's well-being justified some investigation. The library was empty. Irene quickly scanned the desk, finding mostly company correspondence and some bills. As she was about to leave, she noticed a folder hidden behind some books on the lowest shelf. Opening it, she found what appeared to be a copy of Mrs. Eleanor's will, with notes penciled in the margins. "What are you doing in here?" Irene nearly dropped the folder in shock. Victoria was standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on her, an unreadable expression on her face. "I'm sorry, Ma'am, I was looking for something for Mrs. Eleanor to read. She mentioned she enjoys historical novels." Irene kept her voice steady, returning the folder to its place as if it were unimportant. Victoria advanced into the room. "That shelf doesn't have novels, it's for family and business documents." She snatched the folder with a sharp movement. "In the future, ask Antonia for help if you need to find books." "Of course. I apologize for the intrusion." As she left the library, Irene felt Victoria's gaze burning into her back. She was sure she had just made it onto the lady of the house's blacklist. Later, while helping Mrs. Eleanor prepare for dinner, Irene decided to probe for more information. "Mrs. Eleanor, you mentioned documents to sign. Are they very important?" The elderly woman sitting at her vanity while Irene brushed her hair met the caregiver's gaze in the mirror. "Victoria and Mr. Graham, our lawyer, have been talking about updating my will. They say it's to protect my interests, but they don't specify what the changes would be." Mrs. Eleanor hesitated. "Last week they tried to make me sign something when I was drowsy, after drinking a tea that Victoria had prepared." Irene felt a chill run down her spine. "And did you sign?" "No. I said my vision was blurry, and that I needed Richard to be present for any important decisions." Mrs. Eleanor lowered her voice. "Since then, Victoria has been especially insistent with the medications, and I've noticed my evening tea has a different taste. Ma'am, if I may be so bold, don't drink anything that hasn't been prepared in front of you, and if you feel unwell at all, please tell me immediately." Mrs. Eleanor nodded gravely. "You've noticed something is wrong, haven't you? I thought I was imagining things. I don't know what's happening yet, but I promise to find out." That evening after dinner, Irene was informed by Antonia that Frederick Mendoza had arrived for an emergency meeting and that she should serve coffee in the library in 20 minutes. When she entered with the tray, she found Frederick, Victoria, and Mr. Graham in a heated discussion. "We can't wait any longer." Frederick, a portly man in his 70s with white hair and a severe expression, was saying. "The deadline is closing in." "Richard will be back in 2 weeks," argued Mr. Graham. "It would be more prudent to wait." Impossible, Victoria cut in. I have his power of attorney to act on his behalf, and as for the old woman, we'll find a way. They all fell silent when they noticed Irene's presence. She served the coffee, in silence, pretending not to have heard anything, but internally she was processing every word. "Thank you, Irene," Victoria said with false cordiality. "You may go now." Instead of returning to the kitchen, Irene quietly made her way to the study adjacent to the library. Years ago, while working in another old mansion, she had discovered that houses like this often had passages or ways for one room to overhear another, remnants of a time when owners monitored their staff. Her intuition was correct. In the study, a discreet ventilation grate allowed the voices from the library to be heard clearly. Irene moved closer and listened to the ongoing conversation. "The medical report is almost ready," Frederick was saying. "Dr. Morris will cooperate, as always. With that and the altered documents, we can request special power to make decisions on her behalf." "And the incapacity clause?" asked Victoria. "Already included in the new will," replied Mr. Graham. "Once she's declared incompetent, all powers will pass to Richard, which, through the power of attorney, will be exercised by you." "Perfect. And the caregiver?" "She's a problem," Victoria admitted. "She seems to be gaining the old woman's trust. We can either offer her money to cooperate or create a situation to justify her dismissal." Irene moved away from the grate, her heart racing. Now she was certain. They were planning to have Mrs. Eleanor declared incompetent to take control of her assets. The mention of Dr. Morris suggested that even the doctor was involved in this conspiracy. Returning quickly to Mrs. Eleanor's room, she found the elderly woman asleep. Beside the bed, she noticed a half-empty glass of water. Discreetly, she picked up the glass and smelled it. There was a faint, bitter odor that shouldn't have been there. She placed the glass in a plastic bag she had in her purse, planning to have its contents checked later. If they were drugging Mrs. Eleanor to make her appear confused, she would need proof. Sitting in the chair next to the elderly woman's bed, Irene contemplated her next steps. She would have to be extremely cautious. She was alone against powerful and seemingly unscrupulous people, and her main ally, Richard, wasn't even in the country. She took out her phone and sent a message to her daughter. "Tanya, I need you to research something for me. Information on Frederick Mendoza, a partner at Hallister Enterprises, and on a lawyer named Mr. Graham Price. Anything you can find, no matter how insignificant it seems." While waiting for a reply, Irene watched Mrs. Eleanor's restless sleep. She had promised to take care of her, and now that promise meant much more than just physical assistance. It was a matter of justice and dignity. The next morning, she would have to find a way to photograph the documents she had seen in the library, and somehow she needed to alert Richard about what was happening, even if she wasn't sure she could trust him. The silent mansion seemed to hold even more secrets than Irene had imagined, and she was determined to uncover them, one by one, before it was too late for Mrs. Eleanor. The opportunity Irene had been waiting for came 2 days later. Victoria announced she would be spending the afternoon at a charity event at the Metropolitan Club, leaving detailed instructions about Mrs. Eleanor's medications. Frederick would also be at the same event, which meant the mansion would be relatively quiet. "Antonia will be in the kitchen if you need anything," Victoria informed her before leaving, dressed in an elegant navy blue ensemble, and discreet but visibly expensive jewelry. "Dr. Morris will be here late this afternoon for Mrs. Eleanor's weekly appointment. Make sure she takes all her pills before then." Irene nodded obediently, but she had already decided that no unofficially prescribed medication would be administered to the elderly woman under her care. As soon as Victoria's car left the property, Irene helped Mrs. Eleanor settle in the conservatory with a book and a tea she had prepared herself. "I'm just going to take care of a few quick things, Mrs. Eleanor. I'll be back in half an hour, all right?" "Of course, dear. I'm perfectly fine here with my birds and books." Irene went quickly to the library. She needed to find and document the evidence of the plot against Mrs. Eleanor. She knew she had little time, as Antonia could appear at any moment to check if everything was in order. The folder she had seen days before was no longer behind the books. Irene methodically went through each drawer of the desk, taking care not to disturb anything. In the third drawer, protected by a false bottom, She found what she was looking for, a red folder titled Eleanor. Alistair Will 2025 Revision. Inside were several documents, including the original will, dated 3 years prior, and a modified, unsigned version. Using her phone, Irene photographed page after page, comparing the versions. The differences were subtle but significant. In the original document, the majority of the assets were to be divided between Richard and several charities, with a small portion designated for Frederick in recognition of his business partnership. In the new document, there was an additional clause stating that in the event of Mrs. Eleanor's mental or physical incapacity, all decision-making powers would automatically pass to Richard, with a sub-clause allowing Victoria to act on his behalf via power of attorney. Most alarming, however, was an addendum attached at the end. A preliminary medical report signed by Dr. Morris suggesting that Mrs. Eleanor showed consistent signs of accelerated cognitive decline and recommending a more thorough evaluation for a possible declaration of incompetence. Irene continued her search and found another unsettling document, a power of attorney signed by Richard, giving Victoria full authority to act on his behalf in all matters related to the assets and business of the Alistair family during his absence. The date on the document was recent, suggesting Richard had signed it shortly before his current trip. As she was photographing the last document, Irene heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, she put the folder back exactly as she had found it and pretended to be organizing some books when Antonia entered the library. "Oh, there you are," the housekeeper said, looking slightly surprised. "Mrs. Eleanor is asking for you." "I'm on my way. I was just looking for a book she mentioned she wanted to read." Antonia nodded, seemingly unsuspicious, and left. Irene breathed a sigh of relief and quickly checked that the photos had been saved correctly on her phone before returning to the conservatory. Mrs. Eleanor seemed restless when Irene returned. "You were taking a while. I was worried." "I'm sorry, Ma'am. I was looking for that book you mentioned, about the history of New York." Mrs. Eleanor smiled, but her eyes reflected concern. "Irene, I need to tell you something important while we're alone." The caregiver sat beside the elderly woman, noticing how her expression had suddenly turned grave. "In the safe in my bedroom behind Edward's portrait, there are important documents and some items of sentimental value." Mrs. Eleanor lowered her voice, even though no one else was around. "The combination is Richard's date of birth backwards, 037 to 1975. Why are you telling me this, Mrs. Eleanor? Because I feel that soon I may no longer have access to these things. If something happens to me, I need you to keep something for Richard." She held Irene's hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Promise me you'll help him find out the truth." "What truth, Ma'am?" Mrs. Eleanor hesitated, as if weighing her words. "About Frederick, about what really happened with the family business. There are things that not even Richard knows." At that moment, the sound of the doorbell interrupted their conversation. Dr. Morris had arrived for the weekly appointment. "Don't take any new medication he prescribes," Mrs. Eleanor whispered. "And don't leave me alone with him." Irene accompanied the elderly woman to the living room where the doctor was waiting. Dr. Morris was a respectable-looking middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses and a stethoscope always hanging around his neck, a symbol of his authority. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor. How are you feeling today?" he asked with a polite smile. "Perfectly fine, doctor. No complaints." "Excellent, excellent." He turned to Irene. "You must be the new caregiver. Could you give us some privacy for the examination?" Before Irene could answer, Mrs. Eleanor intervened. "I'd prefer she stay, Dr. Morris. Irene has been helping me remember all the details of my day." The doctor seemed displeased, but acquiesced. "As you wish." During the examination, Irene watched the doctor carefully. He asked leading questions like, "Do you remember what you ate the last time your son visited?" Or, "What was the name of that nurse who took care of you last year?" Questions that even someone with a perfect memory would struggle to answer. Mrs. Eleanor, however, remained firm, answering clearly when she knew and honestly admitting when she didn't. "I don't recall that, doctor, but it also doesn't seem like essential information, wouldn't you agree?" At the end of the exam, Dr. Morris wrote a new prescription. "I'm adding a supplement for her memory. and increasing the dose of the anxiolytic. Irene examined the prescription carefully. The new medication was not a common supplement, but a drug with known side effects, including drowsiness and confusion. "Dr. Morris, has Mrs. Eleanor shown any specific symptoms that would justify this medication?" Irene asked. The doctor stared at her, visibly irritated by the question. "I've been a doctor for 30 years, miss. I know what's best for my patients." "Of course, doctor. I just wanted to understand the treatment to better assist her." After the doctor left, Mrs. Eleanor seemed exhausted. "He always tries to confuse me with those impossible questions. Then he notes that I had difficulty with recollection. Don't worry. We won't follow this new prescription without a second opinion." Later, while helping Mrs. Eleanor get ready for bed, Irene decided to partially share what she had discovered. "Mrs. Eleanor, I found the new will they're preparing. There's an additional clause about incapacity that wasn't in the original." The elderly woman didn't seem surprised. "I suspected something like that. What exactly does this clause say?" Irene explained the details, watching as Mrs. Eleanor's face grew paler. "They're trying to have me declared incompetent to take control of everything," the elderly woman concluded, her voice a mix of hurt and indignation. "And they're using my own son in this plan." "I believe Richard may not be aware of what's really happening," Irene suggested. "The power of attorney he signed for Victoria may have been presented to him innocently. Perhaps Richard has always trusted people too much, especially Frederick, who practically raised him in the business." Mrs. Eleanor sighed deeply. "But I can't take any chances. I need to speak with him directly without intermediaries." "I will try to help establish that communication," Irene promised. That night, after Mrs. Eleanor had fallen asleep, Irene reviewed all the photos she had taken of the documents. She transferred them to a password-protected app on her phone and sent copies to her daughter's email as a backup. She then received a message from Tanya. "Mum, I found some things on Frederick Mendoza. He was investigated 10 years ago on suspicion of embezzling funds, but the case was dropped for lack of evidence. I also found an old news article about a dispute with Edward Allister over industrial patents. It seems there was tension between them before Edward fell ill." Irene absorbed this information. The pieces were starting to fit together. The situation was even more complex than she had initially imagined. Determined to explore the safe mentioned by Mrs. Eleanor, she waited until after midnight, when she was sure everyone in the mansion was asleep. Silently, she entered the master bedroom where the elderly woman was resting. The portrait of Edward Allister dominated the wall opposite the bed, a formal portrait of a man with a severe appearance but kind eyes. Carefully, Irene moved the painting, revealing a small safe embedded in the wall. She entered the combination Mrs. Eleanor had mentioned, 57917030. The safe opened with a discreet click. Inside, there was a jewelry box, some yellowed documents, and a sealed envelope inscribed, "For Richard, to be opened only in my absence," in Mrs. Eleanor's elegant handwriting. Respecting the elderly woman's privacy, Irene didn't open the envelope, but examined the other documents. They were mostly old property records, and an original partnership agreement between Edward and Frederick, dated 1985. One item in particular caught her attention: a small leather-bound diary with Edward's name engraved in gold. Irene hesitated, but the urgency of the situation overcame her scruples. She opened the diary to the last written pages, dated about 10 years ago, shortly before Edward was institutionalized. The entries, though brief, were revealing. "Frederick insists on the merger with the Mendoza Group. I refused again. I don't trust their operations in the Amazon. I suspect serious environmental irregularities." And, in the final entry, "Found discrepancies in the financial reports. F seems to be diverting funds to offshore accounts. Will confront him with evidence tomorrow. Eleanor advises caution, but I can't allow this any longer." Irene felt a shiver. What had happened after that last entry? Had Edward fallen suddenly ill the next day? Was it a coincidence? She heard a noise in the hallway and quickly put everything back in the safe, except for a small photo that was loose between the diary pages. An image of Edward, Frederick, and an unidentified third man in front of an industrial plant. She closed the safe, repositioned the painting and quietly left the master bedroom, returning to her own adjacent room. Lying in her bed, Irene contemplated her discoveries. What had started as a suspicion of will tampering now seemed to be something much larger, possibly involving financial crimes, a struggle for corporate control, and perhaps even Edward's mysterious illness. One thing was certain. She needed to protect Mrs. Eleanor until Richard arrived, and somehow she needed to ensure the truth came to light, whatever it might be. Her phone vibrated with a new message from Tanya. "Mom, I found something else important. Mr. Graham Price was the defense attorney in a lawsuit against the Mendoza Group for environmental damages in the Amazon. And Dr. Morris Costa is Frederick Mendoza's second cousin. They're all connected." Irene mentally thanked her daughter's curiosity and research skills. Now she was even more certain she was facing a well-orchestrated conspiracy. Tomorrow would be Wednesday, the day of Frederick's weekly visit, and, according to the documents she had photographed, also the day scheduled for the signing of the new will. She would need to be prepared for any eventuality. Before falling asleep, she sent one last message to Tanya. "If you don't hear from me by tomorrow night, find Detective Riley, your godfather. Tell him everything and send him the photos of the documents." She didn't believe it would come to that, but she had learned over a lifetime that it was always better to be safe than sorry, especially when you were alone against powerful adversaries. Wednesday dawned with a fine, persistent rain over New York City, fogging the windows of the Allister mansion and creating an even heavier atmosphere. Irene woke before sunrise, mentally planning every step of the decisive day ahead. While helping Mrs. Eleanor with her morning bath, she noticed the elderly woman seemed particularly alert and determined. "You know today's the day, don't you?" Mrs. Eleanor asked, as Irene brushed her silver hair. "Yes, ma'am. I saw in the documents that the signing of the new will is scheduled for 4 p.m. Victoria has already informed me. She said it's just a routine update and that Frederick and Mr. Graham will be present as witnesses." Mrs. Eleanor met Irene's gaze in the mirror. "She also mentioned that a Dr. Paul Foster, whom I've never met, will be present to ensure I am in full command of my mental faculties. Probably a psychiatrist to provide the incompetency report they need," Irene commented, helping the elderly woman into a navy blue silk blouse. "Exactly what I thought." Mrs. Eleanor smiled, a sad but determined smile. "You have a plan, don't you, Irene?" "I have a few ideas, ma'am, but I'll need your cooperation and courage. You can count on me. I haven't lived 82 years to be manipulated now." The morning passed with apparent normality. Victoria supervised the preparations for the afternoon meeting, instructing Antonia on the coffee to be served and ensuring everything was impeccable in the formal living room where the event would take place. Around 11 a.m., something unexpected happened. The doorbell rang, and Antonia answered the door, returning with a surprised expression. "Mrs. Victoria, Mr. Richard has just arrived." Victoria visibly paled. "Richard? But he was only supposed to be back next week." Before she could say more, Richard Allister entered the room. Tall and well-dressed, he had the same piercing eyes as his mother, though his face showed the fatigue of a long international flight. "Victoria, I managed to move some appointments forward." He kissed his wife on the cheek. "Where's Mother?" "In the conservatory with the caregiver," Victoria replied, quickly composing herself. "What a wonderful surprise, darling. Why didn't you let us know?" "I wanted it to be a surprise." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "And I also wanted to be here in person for this will update you mentioned on our last call." Irene, who was observing the scene discreetly from the hallway entrance, noticed how Victoria's shoulders tensed. "Of course, darling. It's actually quite routine. Mr. Graham thought it prudent to update some terms." "Excellent. Then my presence will only make things easier." Richard turned and noticed Irene. "You must be the new caregiver. Mother spoke well of you on the phone." "Irene Owens, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure is mine. How is my mother?" Before Irene could answer, Victoria intervened. "She's having good days and bad days, as usual. Dr. Morris increased her medication for the mental confusion." Richard frowned. "Mental confusion? I spoke with her 2 days ago, and she seemed perfectly lucid." "As I said, good days and bad," Victoria repeated, casting a warning glance at Irene. "I'm going to see her right now." Richard headed for the conservatory, leaving Victoria visibly displeased. Irene followed him at a discreet distance, witnessing the emotional reunion between mother and son. Mrs. Eleanor rose with difficulty, her arms outstretched to embrace Richard. "My son, what a wonderful surprise." "Mother, I've missed you so much." Richard hugged her carefully as if afraid of breaking her. "Are you all right? You seem a little worn out." "I'm wonderful, especially now that you're here." Mrs. Eleanor held her son's hands. "You've arrived at a good time. We have much to discuss before this afternoon's meeting." Victoria, who had followed them, intervened. "Richard must be exhausted from his trip, Eleanor. Why don't you rest a little, darling? You'll have time to talk later." "I'm fine, Victoria," Richard replied, his eyes never leaving his mother. "Actually, I'd like to speak with Mother in private." A tense silence fell over the room. Victoria hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave them alone. "As you wish. I'll be in the library, finalizing the preparations for the meeting." She left, but not before casting a meaningful look at Irene, as if reminding the caregiver where her loyalty lay. As soon as Victoria was gone, Mrs. Eleanor indicated for Irene to stay. "She can. Be trusted, son. In fact, Irene has discovered things you need to know." Over the next hour, in low, cautious voices, Irene and Mrs. Eleanor told Richard everything they had discovered: the alterations to the will, the attempts to over-medicate the elderly woman, the suspicious conversations between Victoria, Frederick, and Mr. Graham, and even the notes in Edward's diary. Richard listened in silence, his expression shifting from disbelief to contained fury. "Why did you never tell me your suspicions about Frederick, Mother? You idolized him, Richard. He was your mentor, your godfather. And after your father fell ill, you leaned on him even more. How could I, without concrete proof, ruin that relationship?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, visibly disturbed. "And Victoria, was I really so blind?" "Love can blind anyone, son." Irene showed Richard the photos she had taken of the documents. He examined each one carefully, his expression hardening as he saw the incapacity clause and the way his power of attorney was being used. "I never authorized any of this. The power of attorney I gave Victoria was specifically for day-to-day business decisions during my absence, not for family or estate matters." He looked at Irene with gratitude. "Thank you for protecting my mother and for gathering this evidence. Now I understand why she insisted so strongly that I be here today." "What do we do now?" Irene asked. "They're expecting the meeting this afternoon to make everything official." Richard thought for a moment. "We'll let the meeting happen, but with a few changes to the script they've planned." He smiled, a smile reminiscent of his father's portrait. "Mother, do you trust me?" "With my life, son." "Then let's turn the tables on them." In the afternoon, the Alistair mansion transformed into a meticulously prepared stage. The formal living room, rarely used, was arranged for the occasion. The notary, Mr. Peterson, a solemn middle-aged man, was already present, organizing his papers on a side table. Frederick Mendoza arrived promptly at 3:30 p.m., wearing an impeccable suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He greeted Richard with apparent surprise and joy. "My boy, what a wonderful surprise. We weren't expecting you today." "I decided it was important to be present for this moment," Richard replied with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Graham arrived next, accompanied by a younger man who was introduced as Dr. Paul Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in geriatrics. At 4 p.m. sharp, everyone was present in the room. Mrs. Eleanor, elegantly dressed and seated in her favorite armchair, maintained a serene expression. Irene remained discreetly by her side, attentive to every move. "Well, since we're all here, we can begin," Frederick announced, naturally taking control of the situation. "Mr. Peterson, do you have the documents prepared?" The notary nodded, taking the new will from his briefcase. "Yes, as per Mr. Graham's instructions." "Excellent. Before the signing, however, I'd like Dr. Foster to conduct a brief assessment of Mrs. Eleanor, just to formally record her mental capacity at the time of signing. Richard intervened. That seems excessive, Frederick. My mother is perfectly lucid, as anyone can see by talking to her for 5 minutes. It's just a standard procedure, Richard, Mr. Graham explained smoothly, to protect everyone's interests. If you'll permit me, Dr. Foster began, addressing Mrs. Eleanor, I'd like to ask you a few simple questions. Mrs. Eleanor nodded. Certainly, Doctor. The questions started basic: name, date of birth, current address, and progressively became more complex, including simple math calculations and questions about historical events. Mrs. Eleanor answered everything with clarity and precision. Very good, Dr. Foster concluded, making some notes. You seem perfectly oriented and capable. Frederick and Victoria exchanged worried glances. This was clearly not the outcome they had expected. Excellent, Frederick said, recovering quickly. Then we can proceed with the reading and signing of the new will. Mr. Graham took the lead, opening the document. Basically, Mrs. Eleanor, this new will maintains the same provisions as the previous one, with a few technical updates to reflect changes in legislation. I'd like to hear these technical updates in detail, Richard requested. The lawyer hesitated briefly. Of course, the main addition is a clause that establishes procedures for asset management in the event of the testator's eventual incapacity. And what exactly does that clause say? Richard insisted. Mr. Graham began to read the section in question, using complex legal terms that obscured its true meaning. When he finished, Richard asked to see the document himself. As he examined the pages, Richard asked casually, Mr. Graham, did you prepare 2 versions of this will? The lawyer blanched. What do you mean? I'm confused because the document you just read doesn't seem to be the same one that was in the library folder a few days ago. A heavy silence fell over the room. Victoria pressed her lips into a thin line. Frederick maintained his composure, but his eyes betrayed concern. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard, Frederick said in a controlled voice. This is the only document prepared under your mother's instructions. It was then that Irene stepped forward. Perhaps this can clarify the situation. She showed her phone to Richard, who took it and began to swipe through the photos of the previous documents. Interesting, Richard commented, showing the images to the notary. Mr. Peterson, could you compare this document on my phone with the one you have in your hands? The notary, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, examined the images and then the document on his desk. There are significant discrepancies. The incapacity clause in the current document is much broader and transfers far more extensive powers. Mrs. Eleanor, who had been watching everything with dignified calm, finally spoke. I never authorized these changes. In fact, I never requested any changes to my original will. Frederick tried to intervene. Eleanor, you mentioned several times that you wanted to update your documents. We are simply following your wishes. That is a blatant lie, Frederick, Mrs. Eleanor replied, her voice firmer than anyone would expect from a woman her age. And I suspect it's not the first one you've told in this house. The tension was palpable. Mr. Graham seemed to be weighing his options, while Victoria kept her eyes fixed on the floor. I think we should postpone this meeting, Frederick suggested, trying to regain control. Clearly there's a misunderstanding that we need to resolve in private. There is no misunderstanding, Richard replied. What there is a deliberate attempt to defraud my mother's will by declaring her incompetent in order to seize control of her assets. At that moment, as if to heighten the drama of the scene, Antonia entered the room carrying a tray with glasses of water and a pitcher of juice. She offered one to Mrs. Eleanor first, who accepted a glass of juice. As the elderly woman was about to drink, Irene noticed something strange in the liquid, a white residue at the bottom of the glass. She quickly took the glass from Mrs. Eleanor's hands. Ma'am, I don't think this juice is good. Discreetly, she showed the residue to Richard. What is that? He asked, examining the glass. Probably some sweetener that didn't dissolve properly, Victoria answered quickly. Irene, however, was already on alert. Without anyone noticing, she had seen Victoria slip something into her purse as soon as Antonia entered with the drinks. With a swift movement, Irene approached Victoria. Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you dropped something. and before Victoria could react, Irene pretended to pick something up from the floor, but skillfully retrieved a small unlabeled vial from Victoria's open handbag. "That's not mine," Victoria protested, trying to snatch the vial back. Richard took the object from Irene's hands and examined it. "What is this, Victoria? Why do you have an unidentified vial of pills in your purse?" All the colour drained from Victoria's face. She looked to Frederick as if for help, but the partner remained impassive, clearly disassociating himself from the situation. It's a natural supplement I take." "Then you won't mind if we send it for analysis, along with a sample of this juice," Richard replied, his voice cold. The notary, Mr. Peterson, visibly disturbed, began to gather his papers. "Gentlemen, there seem to be serious issues to be resolved here. I cannot in good conscience proceed with this signing." "I couldn't agree more," said Richard. "In fact, Mr. Peterson, I would appreciate it if you remained as a witness to what is happening here." Frederick, realizing the situation was spiraling out of his control, adopted a new strategy. "Richard, let's talk in private. There are aspects of the family business you're unaware of that motivated some of these decisions." "I'm sure there are, Frederick, and I can't wait to hear them. Perhaps you can also explain what my father meant in his last diary entries about financial discrepancies and offshore accounts." Frederick's face hardened. Without another word, he picked up his briefcase and headed for the door. "This conversation isn't over, Richard. Think carefully before you make accusations you can't support." After Frederick's departure, Mr. Graham also excused himself and left hastily, followed by the confused Dr. Foster. Only the Alistair family, Irene, and the notary remained in the room. Victoria, realizing the gravity of her situation, tried one last gambit. "Richard, darling, I was manipulated in this situation as much as anyone. Frederick convinced me it was for the best, to protect the family's assets." "Spare me, Victoria," Richard cut her off. "I saw the photos of the documents. I saw the vial in your purse. I saw you actively participating in all of this." Victoria opened her mouth to protest again, but realizing it was futile, she simply grabbed her purse and left the room, heading up the stairs toward the master bedroom. The notary, after formally recording that the meeting was cancelled due to documentary irregularities, also took his leave. When they were finally alone, Mrs. Eleanor held Irene's and Richard's hands. "Thank you, both of you." Her eyes were teary, but her face showed profound relief. "For a moment, I doubted we would succeed." "It's not over yet, Mother," Richard warned. "Frederick won't give up easily, and there are larger issues involved here, beyond the will." "I know," Mrs. Eleanor replied with surprising firmness. "It's time for you to know the whole truth about your father, Frederick, and the family business." Irene made a move to leave to give them privacy, but Mrs. Eleanor stopped her. "Stay, Irene. You're part of all this now, and we will still need your help very much." On that rainy late afternoon, as the shadows lengthened in the Alistair mansion, a battle had been won. But Irene knew, as did Mrs. Eleanor and Richard, that the war was just beginning. And somewhere in the mansion, a cornered Victoria was making a frantic phone call to Frederick as she threw clothes into a suitcase. The rain turned into a storm as night fell over New York City. In the mansion's library, lit only by an old lamp and the occasional flash of lightning, Mrs. Eleanor recounted to Richard and Irene the story that had been buried for a decade. "Your father discovered irregularities in the Amazonian operations that Frederick was managing," Mrs. Eleanor explained, her voice weak but resolute. "Illegal deforestation, bribery of environmental inspectors, use of indigenous lands. Edward confronted Frederick, demanding an end to these practices, or he would report everything." "And what happened?" Richard asked, his face tight with tension. "The day after the ultimatum, your father had his first neurological episode. The doctors diagnosed it as a stroke caused by stress." Mrs. Eleanor paused, her distant eyes recalling painful memories. "But Edward, even weakened, remained suspicious. He started writing everything down in the diary you saw. Do you think—" Richard couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too terrible. "I have. No concrete proof, son. But the timing always seemed too convenient for Frederick." As the conversation unfolded, Irene's phone vibrated with a message from her daughter Tanya. "Mum, Victoria just got in a cab on the street by the mansion. We're watching like you asked." Irene had asked Tanya and a few friends to take turns keeping a discreet watch near the mansion, alerting her to any suspicious movements. "Mrs. Eleanor, Richard," Irene interrupted urgently. "Victoria has just left the mansion." Richard stood up quickly. "I'll check the room." When he returned minutes later, his expression confirmed what they already suspected. "She took clothes, jewelry, and documents. She's fled." "That was to be expected," Mrs. Eleanor commented serenely. "I always knew she had no real attachment to this family, only to our wealth." A particularly loud clap of thunder shook the mansion's windows like a dramatic omen. Just then, Antonia entered the library with a worried expression. "Mr. Richard, the gate security just informed me they found this attached to the gate." She held out a waterproof plastic envelope. Richard opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small USB drive. "It's from Mr. Graham," he said, reading quickly. "It seems to be some kind of confession." Irene and Mrs. Eleanor drew closer as Richard read the letter aloud. "Richard, what I witnessed at the mansion today made me realize the gravity of what I helped create. Frederick had been blackmailing me for years with compromising information about mistakes I made early in my career. I was forced to prepare fraudulent documents, including your mother's will. But there's more. Frederick and Victoria were not acting alone. On the attached USB drive, you will find recordings of meetings and copies of documents that reveal the true mastermind behind it all. I ask for your forgiveness for my role in this plot. Though I know I don't deserve absolution, I will be leaving the country tonight as I fear for my safety. Frederick has powerful allies and ruthless methods. Sincerely, Graham Price." A heavy silence settled in the library as they absorbed the letter's contents. "We need to see what's on this USB drive," Richard finally said. They went to the study, where a laptop rested on the mahogany desk. Richard inserted the drive and opened the first file, a video recording dated 3 months prior. The image showed a luxurious office. Seated behind the desk was Charles Ashton, Edward's oldest partner at Alistair Enterprises, a man in his 80s, whom Richard had always considered a second father. "I'm not satisfied with the delay, Frederick," Charles said in the recording, his voice surprisingly firm for a man his age. "The plan was simple. Declare Eleanor incompetent, take control through Richard, and gradually transfer the main assets to our companies abroad." "We're making progress, Charles," Frederick replied, visibly tense. "The will is almost ready. Victoria has been administering the medications as instructed by Dr. Morris. Eleanor is already showing sporadic signs of confusion." "It's not enough. The old woman is too resilient." Charles slapped the desk impatiently. "And what about Richard? Is he still conveniently away?" "Yes, I've made sure he's overwhelmed with the European operations. He barely has time to speak with his mother." The recording continued with disturbing details about how they had gradually manipulated the family business over the past few years, ever since Edward's illness. Richard watched in absolute shock. Charles Ashton, his mentor, the man who had consoled him at his father's funeral and guided his first steps as president of the company, was the true villain behind it all. "I can't believe it," he murmured, pausing the video. "Charles was like a father to me. Why?" "Power and money, son," Mrs. Eleanor replied sadly. "Charles always envied your father. They were partners, but Edward was the true business genius, the public face of the company. Charles lived in his shadow." The following files revealed suspicious financial transfers, practice runs of forging Mrs. Eleanor's signature, and even a list of family properties that were to be gradually transferred to shell companies controlled by Charles and Frederick. This explains why the company's stock has lost so much value in recent years, Richard commented. They were hollowing out the company from the inside. As they examined the files, Irene's phone rang. It was Tanya again. "Mum, there's a car that's been parked on the corner for over an hour. 2 men are watching the mansion." Irene relayed the information to Richard, who immediately contacted the mansion's private security to reinforce surveillance. "We're not safe here," he concluded. "We need to leave and take this evidence to the police." Wouldn't it be better to call the authorities to come here? Irene suggested. We don't know who else is involved in this conspiracy. Charles has connections throughout the judicial and political system in New York. Mrs. Eleanor, who had remained silent while they watched the recordings, finally spoke. I know a place where we can stay temporarily. A small house in the Hamptons that I bought secretly years ago when I started to suspect something was wrong. Not even your father knew about it, Richard. The revelation surprised both Richard and Irene. The frail, elderly woman had resources and foresight that continued to astonish them. How will we do that, Mother? They're watching the house. There's an underground passage, Mrs. Eleanor revealed. Edward built it during the Cold War, fearing political fallout. It leads to an abandoned garage 3 blocks from here. Once again, Richard looked at his mother with new admiration. There was so much about his family he didn't know. Quickly, they devised a plan. Irene contacted her ex-brother-in-law, Michael, a rideshare driver, asking him to wait for them near the passage exit. Richard copied all the files from the USB drive and sent them to multiple email addresses as a backup. Mrs. Eleanor, with Antonia's help, gathered essential medications and a few personal items in a small pack. As they prepared, Richard received an alarming phone call from John, the head of security at the mansion. Mr. Richard, we've just intercepted a radio transmission. Armed men are positioning themselves around the property. They look like professionals. How much time do we have? Minutes, maybe. They're waiting for some kind of signal to move in. Richard hung up, his face pale. We need to go, now. Mrs. Eleanor led them to the wine cellar in the mansion's basement. Behind a rack of rare wines, she activated a hidden mechanism that revealed a metal door. The passage beyond was narrow, damp and dark, lit only by the flashlight on Richard's phone. We haven't used this in decades, Mrs. Eleanor commented as Irene helped her walk through the tunnel. I hope it's still safe. They moved slowly through the underground passage. Mrs. Eleanor, despite her physical frailty, showed admirable determination, refusing to rest even when Irene suggested short breaks. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a metal ladder leading to a trap door. Richard climbed up first, carefully pushing the cover to check if it was safe to emerge. We're in some kind of abandoned warehouse, he reported. Then, helped his mother and Irene climb up. The place was dusty and filled with debris, but the rusty gate leading to the street still worked. Outside, as arranged, Michael's car was waiting. To JFK Airport, please, Richard instructed as they got into the vehicle. And if you can avoid the main routes... Got it, Michael replied, casting a concerned glance at Irene through the rearview mirror. She just nodded, indicating she would explain everything later. As the car snaked through the back streets of New York under the persistent rain, Richard used a burner phone John had given him to make important calls. Julia, it's Richard. I need you to access the company system remotely and block all bank transfers and asset movements. Yes, it's an emergency. Use my personal security code. Don't worry about Charles or Frederick. I'm taking full responsibility. After hanging up, Richard turned to Irene. Julia is my trusted assistant at the company. She'll help freeze everything temporarily until we understand the extent of the damage. Son, Mrs. Eleanor intervened, her voice weak but determined. Call Owen Miles. The federal inspector, the man who used to play poker with Dad. Exactly, he always suspected Charles, and, more importantly, he's one of the few men in a position of authority who doesn't owe any favors to the Alastair family or their associates. Once again, Richard looked at his mother in amazement. You thought of everything, didn't you? Mrs. Eleanor smiled sadly. When you live as long as I have, you learn to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. As Richard made the call to Inspector Miles, Irene received more alarming messages from Tanya. Men broke into the mansion. I heard noises that sounded like gunshots. The police are arriving now. And then, a man, who looks like Frederick, is being taken away by the police. He looks furious. Irene shared the information with Richard and Mrs. Eleanor. John must have triggered the silent alarm, Richard explained. That automatically attracts a police car. Frederick was probably caught by surprise. But what about Charles? Irene asked. He seems to be the real mastermind behind everything. Charles is too smart to show up in person for that kind of operation, Mrs. Eleanor commented. He always uses intermediaries. Richard's burner phone rang. It was Inspector Miles. Owen, thanks for calling back so quickly. Yes, it's exactly what we've suspected for years. We have concrete proof now. We're on our way to JFK Airport. I understand your concern, but we have reason to believe our safety is at risk. Yes, we can meet you there. Hanging up, Richard explained. He's going to meet us at the airport with a team from the FBI. He prefers we hand over the evidence in person, on federal territory. When they arrived at JFK's Terminal 3, it was almost midnight. The rain continued mercilessly, turning the airport lights into colorful blurs through the car's wet windows. Michael stopped the car in the arrivals area, where a tall, middle-aged man in a discreet suit waited for them under a large black umbrella. "Inspector Miles," Mrs. Eleanor acknowledged, as the man opened the car door to help her out. "Mrs. Eleanor, it's good to see you are well." He turned to Richard. "Let's go inside. I have a private room reserved where we can talk." As they walked through the nearly deserted terminal at that hour, Irene noticed two men in dark suits discreetly following them from a distance. Plainclothes federal agents, she presumed. In the private room, Richard handed the inspector the USB drive and summarized everything they had discovered. Miles listened attentively, making occasional notes. "This confirms suspicions we've had for years," the inspector revealed after hearing the full account. "We've been investigating Charles Ashton and his network of companies for at least 5 years, but we always hit a wall due to a lack of concrete evidence and political roadblocks." "And now?" Richard asked. "What happens next?" "The three of you will be under federal protection until we resolve this. We already have a team moving to arrest Charles Ashton as we speak." Frederick was apprehended at the mansion, apparently trying to retrieve some kind of evidence. "And Victoria?" Irene asked. "We haven't located her yet, but we've issued an alert to all borders and airports. She won't get far." Mrs. Eleanor, who had listened in silence, finally spoke. "What Edward always feared has come to pass, Owen. The empire he built was nearly destroyed by the greed of those he trusted most." "But it wasn't, Mrs. Eleanor," the inspector replied gently. "Thanks to your prudence and the help of this courageous lady." He inclined his head toward Irene as they left the private room, heading to a hotel within the airport itself, where they would spend the night under police protection. Irene noticed how Mrs. Eleanor seemed simultaneously exhausted and relieved. The elderly woman held her arm firmly, more for emotional support than physical. "Thank you, Irene," she whispered. "You saved more than an old woman. You saved the legacy of a lifetime." That night, as the storm finally subsided over New York, Irene lay in a luxury hotel bed, something she had never imagined experiencing. From the next room, she occasionally heard Richard's soft voice on the phone, presumably continuing to take measures to protect the family business. Before falling asleep, she sent one last message to Tanya, assuring her she was safe and asking her and her brother to take precautions as well. The battle was not completely won, Irene knew. There was still much to resolve, testimonies to give, trials to face. But that night at least the right people were protected, and the villains were on the run or in custody. Sleep came more easily than she expected, lulled by the knowledge that she had done the right thing, even in the face of danger. 3 months had passed since the dramatic night of the escape through the underground passage. Winter was giving way to spring in New York, and the gardens of the Allister mansion were bursting with color, as if celebrating a new beginning. Irene watched Mrs. Eleanor walking slowly among the rose bushes, leaning on her carved wooden cane. The elderly woman seemed stronger every day, as if the weight of secrets and threats had been more debilitating than any physical condition. "She's recovering well," Richard commented, approaching Irene on the terrace. "The doctors can hardly believe the improvement." "That's what happens when you stop being poisoned daily," Irene replied with a slight smile. "And when you're finally free from fear." The past few months had profoundly transformed everyone's lives. Charles Ashton, the mastermind of the conspiracy, was facing multiple criminal charges, from corporate fraud to attempted poisoning. Frederick Mendoza, after a brief attempt to negotiate his freedom by offering evidence against Charles, was also in custody, awaiting trial. Mr. Graham, the lawyer, had kept his word and left the country, but he continued to cooperate remotely with the investigation. Dr. Morris had his medical license suspended while he faced charges of professional misconduct and complicity in the improper medication of Mrs. Eleanor. And Victoria... Irene glanced at the newspaper open on the terrace table. The headline read, "Former socialite arrested on Mexican border. Victoria Alastair attempted to flee with jewels and cash." "I just spoke with Inspector Miles," Richard continued. "Victoria is negotiating a plea deal. Apparently she has a lot to reveal about the illegal operations in the Amazon." "You're handling all of this well," Irene observed. In recent weeks, she had witnessed Richard's transformation from an absent businessman, oblivious to the manipulations around him, to a man determined to right the wrongs and protect his family's legacy. "I had no choice," he replied, running a hand through his now slightly graying hair at the temples. "When I found out how blind I had been, how much I had allowed my own family to be betrayed right under my nose, there was no other path but to face the truth and rebuild." The restructuring of Alastair Enterprises was underway. Richard had fired executives suspected of involvement with Charles and Frederick, hired independent auditors to review all operations, and initiated an ambitious environmental recovery program in the areas of the Amazon affected by the company's illegal activities. "Irene," Mrs. Eleanor called from the garden. "Come see. The buds on Edward's rosebush are opening." Irene descended the terrace steps and approached the elderly woman, who was proudly pointing to a particularly lush rosebush laden with red buds about to open. "It's beautiful, Mrs. Eleanor." "Edward always said that roses are like the truth," the elderly woman commented, gently touching a petal. "They may take time to bloom, but when they do, their beauty is undeniable." Antonia appeared in the garden, announcing that the guests expected for lunch had arrived. Mrs. Eleanor linked her arm with Irene's, and together they walked back to the mansion. The living room. A middle-aged man in formal attire was waiting with a briefcase. It was Mr. Robert Lewis, the Alastair family's new lawyer. "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. Mr. Richard, Mrs. Owens," he greeted them formally. "I've brought the documents as requested." They all sat in the spacious room, now transformed by the removal of oppressively formal furniture and the addition of more welcoming elements. The heavy curtains that once blocked the natural light had been replaced with lighter ones, allowing the morning sun to flood the space. "As we discussed previously," Mr. Lewis began, opening his briefcase, "I have prepared 2 sets of documents. The first pertains to the transfer of the property in Brooklyn Heights to Mrs. Irene Owens's name." Irene felt her heart race. She still couldn't believe this was really happening. "The second document," the lawyer continued, "establishes the educational fund for Mrs. Owens's children, Tanya and Gregory Owens, as specified by Mr. Richard." "And the third?" Mrs. Eleanor asked, a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "Ah, yes." Mr. Lewis smiled, pulling out another document. "This one officially appoints Mrs. Owens as the administrator of this property, with all pertinent powers and responsibilities, including a monthly salary commensurate with the position." Irene looked at Mrs. Eleanor and Richard, emotion making it difficult to find words. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Mrs. Eleanor replied, holding her hand. "You saved not only my life, but our entire family. It's the least we can do." "Besides," Richard added, "we need someone of absolute trust looking after the mansion and mother, especially now that I'll be spending more time reorganizing the company." "And overseeing your engagement," Mrs. Eleanor teased with a mischievous smile. Richard blushed slightly. In recent weeks, his friendship with Julia, his trusted assistant who had helped him through the crisis, had evolved into something more. Mrs. Eleanor, ever observant, had been the first to notice the change in their relationship. "Will Julia be joining us for lunch?" the elderly woman asked. "Yes, as soon as she finishes a video conference with our lawyers in Washington, D.C., Richard replied. After they had signed all the documents, Mr. Lewis took his leave, leaving them alone again. Irene was still trying to process what had just happened. her own apartment in Brooklyn Heights, one of New York's most valuable neighborhoods, an educational fund that would guarantee college for Tanya and Gregory, and a stable job as the mansion's administrator. "Don't look at me like that, as if we're doing you an extraordinary favor," Mrs. Eleanor said, correctly interpreting her expression. "You risked everything for us without really knowing us, simply because it was the right thing to do. People like you are rare, Irene." Lunch was a light and pleasant affair. Julia joined them, bringing encouraging news about the investigation. More documents incriminating Charles and Frederick had been discovered in a secret safe in the company office. After the meal, while Richard and Julia discussed the next steps for the corporate restructuring, Irene accompanied Mrs. Eleanor back to the garden. The elderly woman seemed particularly nostalgic that day. "You know, Irene, when Edward built this house, he had a dream," Mrs. Eleanor commented, sitting on a stone bench under a leafy tree. "He wanted to create a place where people from different worlds could meet and share knowledge and experiences." It's a beautiful dream. For many years, this mansion was exactly that, a meeting point for intellectuals, artists, politicians, workers. Edward didn't care about titles or bank accounts, only what people had to offer in terms of ideas and humanity. Mrs. Eleanor sighed. After he fell ill, that was lost. The house became cold, isolated. Victoria made sure it stayed that way. And now? Now, I want to restore that legacy. And I need your help to do it. Irene looked questioningly at the elderly woman, who continued, "I'm thinking of turning part of the mansion into a cultural and educational center for children from underserved communities, to use our privilege for something meaningful." Irene's face lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Mrs. Eleanor. Richard has already agreed, and you, with your experience in communities, like the Bronx, would be perfect to help us structure this project." In the following weeks, the Alistair Mansion became a construction site, not just of physical renovations, but of a transformation of purpose. Architects, educators, and social workers frequented the house, planning the conversion of the East Wing into classrooms, a library, and multi-purpose spaces for the future cultural center. Tanya and Gregory, Irene's children, now visited the mansion frequently, helping with the preparations. Tanya, with her talent for technology, was developing a registration system for the future students. Gregory, passionate about music, was already planning the workshops he would offer. On one particularly hectic afternoon, with decorators, electricians, and educators circulating through the property, Irene found a quiet moment in the library. She was organizing books to be donated to the new community library when Richard entered, carrying an old box. "I found this in Dad's office at the company," he explained, placing the box on the table. "I thought you might like to see it." Inside the box were photo albums, old documents, and, to Irene's surprise, a book of poetry with the inscription, "To my eternal Eleanor, who turns each day into a poem of love. Edward, 1965. "Your mother needs to see this," Irene commented, moved. "I've already shown her. It was intense." Richard smiled. "You know, before all this, I barely knew my own parents. I was so absorbed in business, in the ambition to expand something I hardly understood, that I neglected the stories and values that truly mattered." Irene nodded, understanding. Often the people closest to us remain the most unknown. "Which makes me wonder," Richard continued, "if I'm not making the same mistake in other areas of my life." "How so?" "I spent so much time away, traveling, delegating, that I barely know the country I live in, the people who work for me, the communities we affect. I'm thinking of changing that too." The following months witnessed profound changes not only in the mansion, but in everyone involved in the story. Charles Ashton's trial began with extensive media coverage. Frederick Mendoza, seeking a reduced sentence, revealed details of corruption schemes that extended to other major companies and political figures. Victoria, after a failed attempt to negotiate immunity, faced charges of attempted poisoning and conspiracy. Dr. Morris permanently lost his medical license and also faced criminal charges. The inauguration of the Edward Alistair Cultural Centre was scheduled for Mrs. Eleanor's 83rd birthday. The old mansion, once a symbol of isolation and secrets, opened its doors to students from the Bronx, Harlem, and other peripheral communities of New York City. On the eve of the inauguration, Irene found Mrs. Eleanor sitting alone on the garden bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange. "May I join you?" Irene asked. "Of course, dear." Mrs. Eleanor patted the empty space beside her. "I was just talking to Edward." Irene smiled, understanding the depth of the bond that neither time nor distance had broken. "He would be proud," she commented. "Of all this, of the cultural centre, of Richard, of you." "Of you too, Irene." Mrs. Eleanor held her hand. "You know, when Edward and I built this house, he said something I never forgot. A house is made of bricks and wood, but a home is made of courage and love. You brought both back to this family." Irene felt her eyes well up. "You and Richard have given me so much." "No, Irene. You reminded us of what truly matters. Honesty, integrity, courage. Values we almost lost amidst conspiracies and unchecked ambition." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled only by the song of birds settling in for the night. "What do you think will happen now?" Irene finally asked. Mrs. Eleanor smiled, her eyes reflecting the wisdom of a long and full life. "Life will continue its course, as it always does. Richard and Julia will probably get married next year. The cultural centre will grow and touch many lives. The guilty will face the consequences of their choices." "And you?" "Me?" Mrs. Eleanor laughed softly. "I plan to live each day to the fullest, surrounded by people I love and trust. And maybe finally write my memoirs. I have enough stories to fill a library." The next day, the grand gates of the Alistair mansion were opened not for businessmen or politicians, but for dozens of children and teenagers from neighboring communities. The inauguration ceremony for the cultural centre was simple but emotional. Mrs. Eleanor, elegant in a turquoise dress, cut the symbolic ribbon with the help of a little girl from the Bronx. Richard, by her side, gave a brief speech about the property's new purpose, to be a space for transformation and opportunity. Irene, watching the scene surrounded by her children, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey from her first day at the mansion to that moment had been turbulent, dangerous, and unexpected. But every step, every difficult decision had been worth it. Later, after most of the guests had departed, Irene found a moment alone with Richard and Mrs. Eleanor on the terrace, enjoying the view of the garden now filled with new plants and possibilities. "You know what Dad always used to say," Richard commented, contemplating the distant New York skyline. "True wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we can give." "Your father was a wise man," Irene replied. "Yes, he was." Mrs. Eleanor smiled, leaning on her cane. "And I'm sure that wherever he is, he's smiling down on us now." The sun was beginning to set again over the city, casting a golden light on the renewed mansion. The scent of Edward's roses filled the air, mingling with the laughter of the last few children still exploring the gardens. In that moment, Irene understood that she had become part of something bigger than herself, not just a rebuilt family, but a renewed purpose, and that, she realized, was a treasure more valuable than any material inheritance. The Alistair mansion, once a symbol of isolated power and dark secrets, had transformed into a beacon of hope and opportunity. And she, Irene Owens, a simple caregiver from the Bronx, had been instrumental in that transformation, not by signing documents or manipulating situations, but by doing the right thing when confronted with injustice, by defending the truth when it would have been easier to look the other way, by believing in the inherent dignity of every human being, regardless of their social standing or wealth. "I think I finally understand what you meant that first week, Mrs. Eleanor," Irene commented, breaking the contemplative silence. "And what was that?" "About houses having secrets and how some people can read them. It wasn't just about noticing conspiracies or hidden documents." "No," the elderly woman agreed with a serene smile. "It was about seeing into people's hearts. And you, Irene, have always had that gift." The sky was now tinged with shades of purple and pink, heralding the end of one day and the promise of a new dawn. For the Alistair mansion and all who inhabited it, That new day had already begun, illuminated by truth, strengthened by justice, and warmed by the most valuable of assets, mutual trust. Thus, as the first stars began to dot the New York sky, three people united by fate contemplated the future with renewed hope, aware that even in the most unlikely of places, truth always finds a way to flourish. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Irene's journey in the Alastair mansion has touched your hearts and shown how the courage of an ordinary person can transform lives and reveal hidden truths. To continue experiencing emotions like this, we have a special playlist with other incredible stories of transformation and justice. Find it by clicking here on the side. If this story of courage and redemption moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Every day we bring new stories that explore the complexity of American life in all its social layers. And tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation where you had to defend the truth, even when it seemed impossible? Your story can inspire others and show that, like Irene, we can all make a difference when we choose the path of integrity. Until the next story,